I would like to introduce Mr. Joran Liffel, who is the Deputy Chief of Mission of the Swedish Embassy. And I would like to thank Mr. Liffel for allowing Barnes and Thornburg to host this event at this just extraordinarily beautiful venue. And without further ado,
thank you so much. And ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, on behalf of the ambassador who could not be here today because he's meeting with the American Nobel laureates of this year, he's actually meeting the President Obama in about 20 minutes now, so I guess they're in security checkups. So on behalf of the ambassador and the rest of the embassy, a warm welcome to the House of Sweden. I know that you're holding this occasion for the third time. I think the first time you say that you had something once. When you have it the second time, it's a tradition. And the third time confirms the tradition. So I hope to see you here many more times. I would also like to give a special welcome to our dear friend Brad Olsen, who was recently awarded by the Swedish King as commander of the Polar Star for his long and wonderful efforts in making our economic ties and business relations even stronger. And he's a Swedish knight. I'm a Swede, and I'm a Danish knight, so I guess we have something in common anyway. Sweden and the United States have very strong relations, and we've had that for a long time. It's actually dating back until 1783, when Sweden was the first country outside of the Civil War that acknowledged the United States as a sovereign republic. And those relations are stronger than ever. Sweden is the 10th largest investing country in the United States. Per capita, we are the largest. There are about 5 million people in the United States that claim Swedishness, or they have Swedish heritage. About a quarter of the Swedish population emigrated to the United States in the late 1800s. Many of those have created companies, and Swedish companies create more than 330,000 jobs around the country. Perhaps some of them are your clients or colleagues or friends anyway. US companies also create about 150,000 jobs in Sweden, which I think is a wonderful thing. Following the elections, we're very much looking forward to the incoming administration and Congress as well. So I think it's a wonderful opportunity today for all of us to hear what Barnes and Thornburg is going to introduce to us. I think it's a wonderful thing to invite us all to a panel discussion about what to expect during the first 100 days and what that means to business. Sweden will continue to work very strongly with the United States, of course, and our main focus areas will continue to be climate, trade, and security. And our foreign politics will also be maintained through on a fundament of gender equality, where we think that men and women should be treated completely equal when it comes to salaries, education, and everything else. And I hope you agree on that. So once again, warm welcome to House of Sweden. I hope you will enjoy your time here.
We're going to start with our first panel, and our first panel is Rachel Lehrman, who is co-chair of our firm's appellate practice, and she's going to talk to us about what to expect, or what we think, her insights on what. Okay, let's see if it works over here. Have I lost? All right, so we've got this now. So Rachel's going to talk to us about some insights on what she thinks are going to be priorities of the Supreme Court and what we can expect. We also have on the panel Mike Battle and Roscoe Howard. Mike and Roscoe are senior attorneys and leaders in our firm's just premier white-collar practice. Both are former U.S. attorneys. Both have had a long career in law enforcement, and they're going to share what they think companies should watch out for, or expect, or anticipate under the administration. So, you guys?
I think I'm going to start it off. Can everybody hear me? Can't tell if this is working. I think the first comment I make, we've actually talked a little bit. Mike and I both know Jeff Sessions. In our opinion, you're in good hands. Jeff is of the Department of Justice. He understands the Department of Justice. And if you have any concerns about what he thinks about the Department of Justice and how it's supposed to work, listen to his questioning of Loretta Lynch when she was confirmed as the Attorney General. He'll be terrific. I think you'll like him. A short story. Mike and I were both approached in 2001 in the summer. And after they identified the 93 U.S. attorneys they wanted serving across the country, we were all invited to Washington. We were lined up one after another in a line. We were put in chairs, and then one at a time we were invited into the Attorney General's office. And in the Attorney General's office was Bob Mueller, who at the time was about to go over to the FBI. Larry Thompson was there. The head of EOUSA was there. And, of course, the Attorney General. And we were given what Mike and I both describe as a woodshedding. This is what you're going to do, and here are the priorities of the Department of Justice. This went on for about 15 minutes, and you were escorted out. They gave us 10 priorities, and the reason I'm bringing up this story is that this would have been the summer of 2001. Not one of those priorities, not one, was terrorism, not one. And then it was just a few weeks after that, in September, that everybody knows what happened on September 11th. The reason I bring that up is that the Department of Justice is it may be the only department in the federal government that does not dictate policy. Facts dictate policy to them. You react, you don't create. And so when you are talking about where's the Department of Justice going, it's the people outside that are going to determine where the department's going. I will tell you now, as you sit here, for the rest of your lives, and my guess is maybe even for the rest of your kids' lives, terrorism will be the #1 priority. It's difficult. It's an enemy that we're not used to. On September 11th, 2001, I'm sure all of you were watching, but at the Department of Justice, we're all scrambling around, honestly, trying to figure out how to fight it. Don't think it's an accident that we really haven't had another major event on this continent. But also don't think that they're not trying. They do it every day, every day. And so terrorism will be the #1 priority. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that one thing that is mentioned prominently in the election is immigration. The Department of Justice really doesn't play a role in immigration. They do run the immigration courts. But in terms of actual law enforcement, immigration isn't what they do. When you are identifying illegal immigrants in this country and you are talking about identifying them and taking them out, what the Department of Justice does is they identify them if they've committed a crime, you convict them of a crime, and then guess what? You put them in jail here. They don't go anywhere. And then once they're released, you got to figure out where they're going to go. Most of these guys are not self-identifying. They're not going to tell you, well, I'm from Mexico, here's my passport. Doesn't work that way. They come over without papers, now you don't know where to send them back. From that standpoint, I think that that immigrants will be targeted in terms of them committing a crime, but what you're going to see, and Mike, I just turn it over to you with this, what you're going to see is an attack and a real emphasis on violent crime. Those are the things that keep people upset. That's what makes the newspapers. That's what's going to address. That's what the Department of Justice needs to address.
And Roscoe, pardon me, I remember that meeting well with General Ashcroft, and one of the top 5 things that was on that list was violent crime. And a lot of times, ladies and gentlemen, people don't think of the Department of Justice as it relates to prosecuting and investigating violent crime. But the fact of the matter is the department has a long history of doing that. They don't necessarily have boots on the ground, say, like you would in the D.C. office where Roscoe was U.S. Attorney, because they don't have a DA's office. So what the department does is it pushes out policies to the 93 U.S. Attorney's offices around the country to give support and to collaborate with the DA's offices in dealing with crime, because let's face it, those local agencies simply couldn't do it without that kind of assistance. And they do it in a collaborative way, they do it in a team sort of way, and they do it in a way that makes sense but is responsive to what the locals are requesting. And they deal with everything related to drug prosecutions, enforcement of gun laws, and things of all sorts of nature, but they are not necessarily the lead agency, but they definitely play a vital role in dealing with those issues. The other thing that the department will do, we think, is get out in front in relation to smart criminal justice issues. One of the most compelling issues I think that will come into what we think about these days is matters related to stop and frisk. And you heard some discussion about that from the president-elect. And that will implicate all kinds of things, not the least of which will be various components of the U.S. Constitution. I don't know if Rachel, if you want to comment on that.
Well, you're absolutely right. That's a constitutional issue, and we're looking at what's going to happen with the Supreme Court. Most of us think of Justice Scalia as a very conservative justice, but I think you'll agree that he was the citizen's friend when it came to Fourth Amendment issues. And it's very unclear what sort of conservative justice will be picked to replace him, since he certainly can't be cloned. So that's another issue that probably doesn't spring immediately to mind when it comes to the Supreme Court, but I think it's going to be important.
The other area that you'll see a lot of discussion about, and a lot of discussion from the president-elect, were matters related to cybercrime. If you go back 20 plus years, when we heard about cybercrime as prosecutors and investigators, we heard about identity theft. People were worried about their credit cards being stolen, things of that nature. Well, fast forward 20 years, and now we're hearing about big intrusions and hacking inside large companies, even inside the government, right on down to the White House. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a very serious problem. And the big problem is it's very hard to detect. You never know who's doing it. And more often than not, the perpetrators are overseas, and they reside in countries that we don't have a friendly extradition policy with. So prosecuting and bringing these folks to justice is very, very difficult. It's going to require a lot of cooperation across the board with all the federal agencies, law enforcement, at the state, local, and federal level. Ladies and gentlemen, it's just a matter of such that it's not a question of if you become a victim, it's a question of when.
And as you look at cybercrime, you might be reminded of a 1930s bank robber named Willie Sutton. And they asked him, you'll all recall this, why do you rob banks? He says, well, I rob banks because that's where the money is. And so that's what cybercrime is. We were commenting today, I have not seen a paycheck in probably 2 decades. And most of you have never seen your cash. You get a report that says what it is, but you have never seen your piles of cash. And so when these cyber criminals are looking at what they want to steal and where they want to steal, the big issue that you're going to see, one of the big issues you're going to see out of this administration, because they're going to have to adjust it, is health care fraud. That's because, I mean, you heard Marty's comment, you saw the campaign. They're going to want to repeal and replace or repeal or replace Obamacare, whatever it may be. What that means is that there will be money flowing in and out of from the government into different systems. There'll be insurance companies trying to collect. There'll be cash kind of laying around, and people won't know how to claim it, and people will be trying to steal it. And just so you know, I mean, what I used to tell my prosecutors when I was in office is, don't overthink this stuff. And so if you are going to rob a place, you hit what is called a soft target. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm looking at a room full of soft targets. My guess is most of you have the same password on all your machines and those sort of things. But as you're looking at healthcare and as you are trying to make decisions for you baby boomers about whether you want to go into Medicare, Plan A, Plan B, Plan C, as you're changing jobs, as your retirement accounts or healthcare accounts are following you, somebody is trying to steal it. And the reason you're going to see healthcare as a big issue is because when you look at the federal government, that's where they're going to be spending their money for probably the next decade. Okay? And with that, I think it's Laura's turn, right? There you go. Oh, Rachel, I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. Well, you were so profound, I didn't know.
Well, I'm not going to predict who the ninth justice is going to be on the Supreme Court. Although I was more prescient than many about the election because I really thought either side could win. But I don't even know when we're going to get a ninth justice. Could be a year from now. I guess if we're optimistic, it could be before the summer recess, but I think more likely we're going to be waiting a year. We're going to get a conservative justice, that's true, but that's a term that I would use advisedly because, as I just mentioned, Justice Scalia was not conservative or what we think of as conservative when it came to things like the Fourth Amendment. So I think for a year, in any event, we're going to have the possibility of 4-4 splits on some cases. We're going to have fewer cases decided. We may have some non-decisions that we had with the last Affordable Care Act case, the Little Sisters case, where the justices basically said, go back and work it out yourselves. Eventually, there will be another justice, presumably a conservative one. And then on social issues, I would expect us to go back to what we've had for a while now, which is 5-4 splits, with Kennedy being the swing vote. Now, if one of the older justices leaves the bench and another conservative justice is appointed, then yes, the court could swing decidedly in the conservative direction. But because I use the word conservative advisedly, it's pretty hard to predict what that will really mean outside of, say, labor. I think labor, we can make a couple of predictions. The Friedrichs case that went 4-4, that was to do with whether people had to pay union dues, whether public employees were required to pay what they call agency dues. That split 4-4, and I am pretty sure that with a fifth conservative vote that we could see the unions losing that. There's an NLRB case that's likely to come up pretty soon that has to do with whether union employees can be required to waive class arbitration. We have a circuit split on that, with the 7th and the 9th Circuit agreeing with the NLRB that you can't have that under the National Labor Relations Act, but I think it's a pretty good chance that a 9-member Supreme Court would not go with the union on that one. So I think as soon as the court is restored to the number 9, we're going to see definite changes in labor law. I think other important issues to business include issues like preemption. And preemption is something we think of as associated with conservative justices, but not always. Justice Thomas isn't keen on preemption. And Clarence and Justice Scalia wasn't keen on stare decisis. So it will really depend on who the individual is, and hopefully we will get some sort of insight into what they think about these important issues. Obviously, federal preemption is really important to the pharmaceutical industry and the environmental groups out there. Hopefully someone is going to ask them something besides whether they own a gun. Hopefully we will get some real insight into how they think about these issues that really will matter to the business community.
Thank you. All right. Thank you. Appreciate it. We're going to hear from David Spooner. David's going to talk to us on some insights on trade and what we can expect there. As you know, trade was a big issue. Just a word about David. He is co-chair of our International Trade Practice Group. He was former Assistant Secretary of Import Administration at Commerce. He was previously with the USTR. And David is frequently quoted in news media on trade issues. So we're delighted to have him share some views.
Thank you, Karen. And I am a panel of one, so I will be mercifully brief. Karen talks about me being quoted in the press. I often get quoted in Women's Wear Daily, and my colleagues in the trade group tease me mercilessly about it. But as Karen mentioned, trade, of course, was a big issue in the campaign. President Trump and his chief trade and economic surrogates promised to make fundamental or some big changes to U.S. trade policy, and President-elect Trump often called trade negotiators stupid, and I used to think, gosh, he's talking about me. But I don't think I'm stupid. But President Trump has promised to make, and I'm simplifying a little bit here, 4 groundbreaking changes to U.S. policy. President-elect Trump has promised to pull the U.S. out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, trade agreement on day 1 of the administration, has promised to seek to renegotiate NAFTA and to pull the U.S. out of NAFTA if Canada and Mexico do not engage, has promised to challenge unfair Chinese trade practices and to impose a tariff on all Chinese imports. At one point, President-elect Trump mentioned a tariff of 45% if China does not, quote-unquote, behave, and to negotiate tougher agreements with both Cuba and Iran. I should say, for those of you who are with companies that have supply chains that take advantage of free trade agreements or work for trade associations that have such companies, although President-elect Trump focused on NAFTA, of course, I think there has been curiosity as to whether that desire to renegotiate NAFTA would extend to other free trade agreements such as CAFTA that are similar. So, should companies be concerned? Should companies follow things closely? Of course. I mean, the president himself, President-elect himself, has said that he'll make what would amount to extremely big changes in U.S. trade policy and to shake things up. Wilbur Ross, for what it's worth, the gentleman who President-elect Trump nominated to be Commerce Secretary yesterday, was very involved in the CAFTA negotiations. He at the time had bought 2 U.S. failing textile companies, had combined them into one, and was very eager to have CAFTA benefit both companies. And Dan D'Amico, the gentleman who's in charge of organizing the new U.S. trade representative, someone I came to know well. I worked for a congresswoman from North Carolina for a long time, and he was a constituent. And as a steel CEO, when I was at the Commerce Department, he, as all steel CEOs do, take advantage aggressively of the trade remedy laws. All these people plan to make fundamental changes, but I wouldn't be all doom and gloom. I think there, for many companies and trade associations, will be opportunities even if all of these things come to pass. You talk to the U.S. Chamber and you talk to companies that take advantage of NAFTA, and they'll all quietly tell you that NAFTA needs updating. It's 25 years old. For a long time, the lumber industry, the softwood lumber industry, the dairy industry, the U.S. auto industry has sought, or at least hoped for changes to NAFTA. I work closely with apparel companies, and they've not always been fans of NAFTA's product-specific rules. So even if the U.S. begins to renegotiate NAFTA, for every concession that Canada and Mexico makes, or at least often, the U.S. will have to make a similar concession, and with that, there are opportunities for U.S. companies. TPP, I think a lot of folks are loath to admit it, but TPP wasn't going to pass in its current form. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and House Speaker Paul Ryan are both extremely pro-trade and worked closely with President Obama to pass a trade bill 2 summers ago. Both of them say it's not coming up anytime soon because the votes aren't there. The votes aren't there because in the last round, the administration made concessions on rice, tobacco, autos, a certain class of pharmaceuticals, and a few other products. You don't have to be a full-time lobbyist to guess how many votes in Congress the tobacco, rice, dairy, and auto industries and pharmaceutical industries influence. So TPP was going to have to be tweaked in some way, and insofar that the administration is going to change it, it's what probably needed to happen anyway in order for it to pass. Across-the-board tariffs on Chinese imports, it's not going to happen. The president doesn't have the executive authority to do so, although some point to an obscure law that Nixon used at once, a law that allows the president to impose tariffs to address balance of payment issues. But although we may get tough policy on China, see China named as a currency manipulator or a self-initiation of a trade remedy case or two, we won't see across-the-board tariffs imposed. And I'll simply end with the idea that, at least for those of you who are involved in trade policy, it's something, frankly, I suffered from until a week ago, where I sort of had this epiphany. For years, the two big U.S. trade initiatives have been TPP and TTIP, the Trans-Pacific and Europe trade negotiations. We'll have a clean slate under a Trump administration, so I would simply encourage all of you who care about trade policy to sort of put together your wish list. We might have out-of-the-box trade appointees and an administration that doesn't feel like they have to stick to TPP the way it was configured, or even to continue the TTIP negotiations. We could see a free trade agreement with the UK. We could see trade negotiations with key African countries which have been growing so quickly, like Kenya. We could see our Latin American free trade agreements being linked together, or all sorts of other initiatives that haven't happened that folks have wished for. And with that, I'll simply end, and I think we're taking questions at the end.
Yeah, we're going to save some time for questions at the end. So our last panel is we're going to hear about health care. Thank you, David. That was excellent. David's also my colleague in trade, too. So last panel, we're going to hear about health care, and I'd like to introduce Laura Sang, who has come from Chicago to speak to us about that. And then also Eddie Ayub is our senior Republican. I left my notes at the table. Eddie, our senior Democratic lobbyist, is going to talk to us about some insights on the Hill from the Democratic perspective. And to balance that is Craig Burkhart, our senior Republican lobbyist, who's going to give the opposite point of view. So with that, thank you.
Okay, from the short and okay.
Does that work for you?
Is that one back on?
Yeah,
okay.
that works.
From the short and sweet perspective, since I'm from a height standpoint, I'm going to try to meet both those criteria. So thank you all for being here. From the healthcare perspective, obviously that was sort of one of the million-dollar questions that were coming into this election, and now everyone is sort of sitting back and waiting to see what's gonna happen. Being from Indiana, I have to tell you that yesterday's selection of Seema Verma as the new administrator for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services is kind of exciting for those of us from the state, especially those of us who got a chance to work with her during her development of Indiana's alternative Medicaid expansion program. So in terms of what I think we're going to see from a healthcare standpoint with the new Trump administration, with the selection of Tom Price to be the Secretary for Health and Human Services and the combination of him with Seema Verma for CMS, we're going to see some sweeping changes, I think, consistent with their traditional kind of conservative positions. But I think also that given the fact that now we have 18 to 20 million new folks who were previously uninsured, who are now individuals who are carrying health insurance for the first time by virtue of aspects of the Affordable Care Act in terms of either state insurance exchanges, staying on their parents' plans, and the Medicaid expansion across the country, I think it's now going to be really difficult at this point in time. It would have been a little easier a couple of years back. At this point in time, I think it's going to be a little bit harder to scrap Obamacare in its entirety without providing some kind of immediate viable alternative. But I think we are going to see a fairly radical overhaul of some of the basic tenets of the Affordable Care Act. But I think it's just going to happen a little bit more gradually than probably what was maybe touted during the campaign. I don't think you're going to see it happen immediately. I think it's going to happen in layers. But keep in mind that each of Donald Trump, Ron Price, and Seema Verma all have espoused some of the same core objectives, and those are going to be reflected, I think, in both the legislative action as well as the public policy changes. One of those is going to be a return of more control to healthcare providers and to patients to coordinate their care and collaborate on their care. The new buzzword is going to be patient-centered care coordination, and that's going to be a big piece of any new policies. Second, I think, is going to be a focus on more enhanced funding combined with patient incentives for preventive care and care being delivered in the most cost-effective manner and the best treatment settings. And combined with that is probably going to become more penalties and some cost sharing by patients who haven't experienced that in the past for things like unnecessary ER visits or consequences of non-compliance with their health care plans. So I think there's going to be a bigger emphasis on trying to decrease some of the waste that we see from a healthcare standpoint across the country and some of the services that are delivered, and trying to save some money in terms of duplication of services. And there's going to be an additional focus, I think, on personal accountability and personal choices and control. There are going to be some certain aspects, I think, of the Affordable Care Act that are going to remain in place in terms of coverage for pre-existing conditions. It's going to be next to impossible, I think, to try and take that away, but there will be some tweaks to that, I am sure. Coverage of children on their parents' plans to age 26 is probably something that's going to stay in place, and probably more emphasis on pricing transparencies. But there are going to be some, I'm guessing here, we're all trying to do the crystal ball thing, but I think there's going to be some pretty drastic changes and some repeals of some of the other aspects of the Affordable Care Act. The individual mandate to purchase insurance is most likely going to go away. It's probably going to get replaced with a series of tax breaks and tax credits to try and encourage people to purchase individual policies. But I will be shocked if the individual mandate isn't one of the first things that goes away. I'm anticipating there's probably going to be changes to healthcare savings accounts, higher levels of tax-free contributions, more ability to use health savings accounts within a family, more ability to transfer the funds that are in those accounts to people within the same family, and probably an elimination of some of the minimum policy requirements that are in some of the insurance plans right now, to allow for more plans that just have catastrophic coverage, and combining those types of healthcare policies with healthcare savings accounts. And I think we have seen kind of a foreshadowing of some of what's coming in looking at Representative Price's Empowering Patients First Act that he first tried to put together back in 2015, where there were a lot of adjustments in terms of tax credits and allowing individuals, for example, to opt out of Medicare and Medicaid or out of the federal employee benefit plans, and even opting out of employer-sponsored plans in terms of being able to utilize tax credits on an individual basis to purchase their plans in the free market. So I think in terms of trying to increase competition among insurance carriers and trying to push down more control at the individual level, I think we're going to see a much bigger emphasis in terms of tax credits and a much bigger push towards giving individuals the opportunity to opt out of the plans that they're in right now, and allowing for more transferability. From an employer standpoint, I think employers are going to see a lot of changes, and I know that's making folks in the business world pretty nervous. There's going to be, I would anticipate, some new limits on the employer tax exclusions for the healthcare coverage benefits that they're providing, and a bigger push to allow employees to either take the insurance plan of their employer-sponsored plan or to take the cash, and employers being either incentivized or perhaps mandated to provide that as an alternative, to give the cash to the employees and let them make their own choices out on the healthcare exchanges. And that way they'll have plans in place that they can transfer from job to job. And I think that's going to be a big push from this administration. There's going to have to be something on the bottom side of it to address the high-risk, high-cost patients, folks who are in chronic disease management programs, for example, chronic mental health illnesses, et cetera. So I think we're going to likely see a big shift in the Medicaid funding in terms of moving that into block grants down to the state levels, so that each of the states can design and manage their own high-risk pools and how to deal with the folks that are at highest risk. And I think that we're going to see that especially now with Seema Verma being named yesterday, because her work in terms of working her and Mike Pence together on the Healthy Indiana plan requires patient accountability. That plan has pieces involved in it that include patients having some skin in the game, which is not typical for a Medicaid program. So I think we're going to start to see some changes there that are going to push that funding down to the state level, so that the states can start to design their own programs in terms of trying to figure out how to treat patients and how to protect patients, and still let folks have some authority and some accountability in the choices that they're making. But I think we're going to see some pretty sweeping changes in the next 100 days.
Hello, I'm Craig Burkhart, and as was said earlier, I'm one of the Republican-oriented lobbyists that is with the firm. And Eddie and I are the last on the agenda, and we decided that we would talk to not detailed programs, but themes. I'm going to talk about a couple of statutory themes, and I'm going to address it directly to business people and association people. What you should be thinking about strategically as you move forward, either in a defensive or an offensive mode to forward your business or association interest. Eddie's going to talk a little bit procedural-oriented things that are related to these statutory themes. Briefly, our management asked me to remind you that Barnes & Thornburg has a robust lobbying program, and we embrace the word lobbyist because we do achieve a lot of wonderful things for our clients, and I just wanted to introduce each one of them very, very briefly. If you can just wave your hand. Of course, Bob Grand, who you already met, Republican. Bob. Very much involved in the Pence campaign and in the Trump campaign as well, and a very accomplished lobbyist from our Indianapolis office. Richard Boykin over here to my right, a very accomplished lobbyist, Democrat from the House side, and very also very involved back in the Midwest, particularly in the Chicago area. David Paragas from Ohio. He may be not here right now, but one of our Republican lobbyists. Eddie Ayub, one of our Democratic lobbyists, whose background originally was from the Senate, but very much involved in both the House and the Senate, and really our procedural expert on matters concerning both the House and Senate. Matt Morgan, I thought I saw Matt walk in here. Matt Morgan is a resident in our Indianapolis office. He's the young guy who is just became one of our capital partners and is a direct legal advisor to Pence and the Pence gubernatorial campaign and the vice presidential campaign. He's not a full-timer lobbyist, but we kind of include David Spooner as one of our lobbyists over here as well, because he's so good at the trade issues, and obviously trade issues are going to be very important to all of you. I am resident here in Washington. I also am very active in the Illinois market, and I also have a Trump background. I was one of the legal advisors to the Trump campaign. So we're very well positioned to have you speak with the new administration to the extent that that is relevant to your organization. Here's a couple of thoughts. And this, I'm talking about your strategic vision for your organization, whatever it is. If your organization is either based upon or profits from an intense regulatory structure, or there is an intense regulatory structure of some type that is a barrier to your profitability or expansion, this is going to be a very, very active year coming up, really a couple of years, because the Trump administration coming in has a very cooperative congressional set of Republicans that are going to be interested in looking at that. Block grants would be an example of that. Infrastructure is going to be a very, very big issue. Of course, the ACA was already talked about, and tax will be a big issue. So those are the kinds of things you ought to be taking a look at. Now, Eddie's going to talk a little bit about some of the procedural aspects of these things.
Thanks, Craig, and I'll make it quick because I know everybody wants to get to the bar. No one needs to get to the bar faster than Democrats after a discussion like this. So, but to pick up on what Craig was saying, I think for Democrats in particular in the Senate, I mean, the House pretty much runs by majority rules. So the Speaker will pretty much be able to ram his agenda, the administration's agenda. Ironically, the biggest challenge that they will have in the House will be intra-party between the base of the Republican Party and the more establishment mainstream portion of the party. So that'll be an interesting dynamic. But the real fight is going to be in the Senate. Assuming that the Louisiana race comes out the way that we expect, that will be a Republican victory, it'll be 52-48 will be the split in the Senate, Republicans in control. A couple procedural things that are going to play out Rachel was talking earlier about a Supreme Court justice. There will clearly be a Supreme Court nomination, at least one, obviously, because we have that vacancy. You may recall the so-called nuclear option that Senate Democrats employed with respect to nominations and federal judgeships not counting the Supreme Court. Senator McConnell will be under extreme pressure to apply the nuclear option to Supreme Court justices. He's an old bull of the Senate. How he chooses to move forward on that remains to be seen, but I think that's going to be one of the more interesting procedural tactics to play out. Laura was talking earlier about some of the changes that are coming on ACA and other things. There's also a process called reconciliation. If the Republicans do not invoke the nuclear option with respect to legislation, right now you still need 60 votes on any motion to proceed to a particular bill, but there's this process called reconciliation through the Budget Control Act of '74, whereby you only need 51 votes. And as long as you can show that you have an impact on the federal budget, that's where you use the reconciliation process. So a lot of things that would otherwise need 60 votes, you're only going to need 51 votes. That's where senators like Lisa Murkowski of Alaska and Susan Collins of Maine, both Republicans, are probably going to play queen makers, if you will, because these two senators are viewed as the more moderate, most moderate of the Republican Party. So that's where you're going to see, I think, some things, the interesting things play out is on the procedure. Democrats are just going to have to pick their battles. They can't fight everything. Roscoe was talking earlier about Jeff Sessions. There are a lot of Democrats who are opposed to Jeff Sessions, but is that the fight that they want to take on right away? Will it be the Supreme Court nominations, what have you? I think you'll see Senate Democrats go along with some things that this administration wants to do, perhaps related to infrastructure, but how you pay for it is going to be the story. On immigration, that's going to be a huge fight. Obamacare, ACA is going to be a huge fight, what you keep, what you get rid of. But that's really where the game's going to be from my perspective, is Senate Democrats picking their battles, and it'll be interesting to see how the administration handles that and how they decide which battles they want to fight as well. So should be very interesting.
Okay, thank you very much, panel. What we're going to do, instead of having questions, everybody's going to stick around. He got introduced and he wasn't there. Matt Morgan, who's been a key part, advisor to campaign, the state campaign, and also for Governor Pence. He's here. He just got here late. I want to introduce him and just say thank you all. Everybody's going to stick around. You got questions, come by and see us. But thanks for coming out, and we really, really appreciate it. Thank you.